Why was Japan's top naval leader singled out for elimination? What made him so important that the Americans would risk a number of pilots and late-model fighter planes, rare commodities during that phase of the war in the Pacific? Was the mission worth the possibility that the Japanese would discover that their top-secret naval code had been broken? Yamamoto was not his real surname. He was born to the Tano family on April 4, 1884 in the village of Nagaoka in the bleak northwest of Japan's main island, the seventh and last child of a poor school teacher and former samurai named Sadayoshi Takano. He was not given a first name for over a month after his birth. Tano's wife, exasperated at her husband's apparent disinterest in the lad, nagged and insisted he give the child a name. Finally, while playing his favorite game of Go, a form of Japanese checkers, Tano replied, "I was 56 years old when he was born. Call him 56. In Japanese, the word for 56 is Isoroku, and that is the first name given to the man who would later be so feared and hated by American forces during World War II. Isoroku learned a little English and was exposed to Christian teaching by an American missionary named Newell during his preteen years. However, little is known about what effect, if any, this man had on Isoroku feelings toward America or Americans. He attended the Nagaoka Middle School, where boys were sent on long marches, especially in bad weather, to toughen them up and prepare them for future military service during the winter months. Yamamoto recalled, "Our hours were longer and our tasks were made much harder. The purpose was to build endurance. The room was heated only by hibachi. The temperature was half of what would be considered necessary in a foreign home. On the 9th day of the midwinter month, thought to be the coldest day of the entire year, no fire was allowed. We were given a 100 ideographs to write. We must keep at the task until it was finished, no matter if the brush fingers became purple and frozen, and there was no feeling from the wrist down. When the work was done, we thawed our hands by rubbing them in snow." At 16, Isoroku decided to apply for entrance into the Imperial Naval Academy at Etajima at a time when Japan was building a large navy. At the turn of the century, Japan had 76 warships in its fleet, and the best and brightest of Japan's young males were encouraged to man them. Isoroku placed second among the 300 who competed for vacancies and entered the academy in 1901. The course was not an easy one. Biographer John Dean Potter noted that cadets were not permitted to drink, smoke, or go out with girls. The lives of these dedicated monastic youths would be devoted until death to the glory of the Red Emperor and their homeland of Nippon. Isoroku graduated 7th in his class in 1904, a time when Japan's leaders had embarked on a strategy of conquest against Russia. War began that year with a surprise attack by a Japanese destroyer against the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. 3 Russian battleships were badly damaged and a cruiser was sunk. For the next 3 months, Admiral Hahachiro Togo, Japan's most famous naval leader, blockaded the port, hoping to tempt the Russian ships out of the harbor to fight. Isoroku was assigned to the cruiser mission 1 of Togo's protecting ships. The Russians, outgunned and outnumbered, sent a fleet of 27 warships from Europe to attack the blockading ships from behind. It took months for the Russians to arrive at the Straits of Tsushima in a single day. May 27, 1905, the Russians lost 23 of their ships. The 4 survivors struck their colors in surrender. Isoroku had been in the battle and described what happened to him in a letter to his parents. "When the shells began to fly above me, I found I was not afraid. The ship was damaged by shells and many were terminated." At 6:15 in the evening, a shell hit the Nishin and knocked me unconscious. When I recovered, I found I was wounded in the right leg and 2 fingers of my left hand. The middle and index fingers were missing. Later he described the incident differently. With a great roar, a shell scored a direct hit on the forward 8-inch gun that still remained. Billows of acrid smoke covered the forward half of the vessel, and I felt myself almost swept away by a fierce blast. I staggered a few steps and found that the record charts that had been hanging around my neck had disappeared, and that 2 fingers of my left hand had been snapped off. Thereafter, Isoroku became known in the Shimbashi Gisha district as Ain because the regular charge for a manicure of all 10 fingers was 1 yen. And his favorite Gisha charged him for only 8. Isoroku was a serious young man on duty and did not drink, smoke, or socialize much with his brother officers. A complex man, he was professional to the Core keenly interested in naval tactics, but he did not shun the pleasures of off-duty life. He visited the geisha houses frequently when ashore, short in stature 5'3", and he was highly intelligent, sentimental, earthy, blunt in speech, and a passionate gambler. One author who had met him before World War I described him leather-faced, bitter heart, a hard chunk of a man, hair cropped as short as the bristles on a beaver tail, cactus lips, thick Jew, heavy chin, prominent. Yamamoto was obsessed with punctuality and harshly bared any subordinate who was not on time for meetings and appointments, an obsession that was later to prove fatal. He went on many training cruises to Australia and the west coast of the United States. There seemed to be no doubt among his colleagues that he was destined for high rank after Izuroku's father and mother died in 1913. In accordance with Japanese custom, he was adopted into the more prosperous Yamamoto family, who traced their forebears to ancient warriors who had fought in the Shogun Wars. Such adoptions were common in Japan by families without a male heir. In 1916, he formally renounced the name of Takano in a Buddhist ceremony. Isoroku Yamamoto remained single until the age of 33, when he married Reiko Mahashi, 22, daughter of a rich farmer. Shortly after the 1918 marriage, Yamamoto was sent to Harvard University for a year without his bride. He took an intensive course in English and majored in economics. He learned to play poker and became extremely fond of the game because it required an ability to bluff his opponents and determine what cards they might hold, a skill he identified with naval tactics and strategy. One of Yamamoto's special interests in his economic studies was the petroleum industry, which he realized was of utmost importance to any navy, especially his own, because Japan had minimal oil resources and was greatly dependent on imports since fuel was limited. The world's third largest navy was constantly haunted by the specter of an oil shortage. As a result, most of the fleet's training during World War I was restricted mainly to the waters off the Pacific shores of Japan. As World War I progressed, Yamamoto became interested in the use of aircraft. In an interview with a National Geographic writer in 1915, Yamamoto was asked what he considered the war vessel of the future. The most important ship of the future will be a ship to carry airplanes, he replied. As he advanced in the Navy, he argued frequently in favor of aircraft carriers. His arguments were strengthened when the Americans began experimenting with launching planes from ships, and the British Royal Navy built the world's first aircraft carrier in 1918. Although thoroughly trained in the strategy and tactics of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats, he was adamant that in his belief the most important ship of the future would be one that would carry airplanes. Yamamoto had severe critics when asked how he could expect to destroy a battleship except with a battleship. He answered with torpedo planes and quoted a Japanese proverb, "The fiercest serpent may be overcome by a swarm of ants." In 1919, Yamamoto was assigned to Washington as assistant naval attaché for a 2-year tour. He was promoted to captain in 1923. While visiting Europe, and the following year, although not a pilot, was made second in command of Japan's first naval air training center at Kumura, presumably because he had developed a reputation as a hard taskmaster and disciplinarian. Upon arrival, he found the pilot trainees to be an undisciplined lot with long hair, sloppy uniforms, and a casual attitude toward authority. To gain their respect, he took flying lessons and solo, then began to take strong measures against those who deviated from correct officer decorum and flaunted the regulations. As biographer Hiroyuki Agawa noted, Yamamoto was genuinely afraid that the tendency of flyers to see themselves as specially gifted persons who could do anything by relying on intuition without paying proper attention to logical method, together with the concomitant tendency to behave like hoodlums, would be bad for the future of aviation. In 1926, Yamamoto returned to the United States and served as naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. until 1928. His duty was to learn as much as possible about the American Navy, its history, policies, strategy, tactics, budget, and plans. During this assignment, friendly American naval officers taught in bridge, which he learned quickly. An inveterate gambler by now, he was fascinated by card games. As he explained later, "Our language has no alphabet, and each single word or syllable is represented by a character. A Japanese has to keep 5,000 ideographs in his head. After that, at his child's play, to remember 52 cards. Japan had been an ally of Great Britain and the United States during World War I in 1921 at an arms limitation conference in Washington. As a reward for its support, Japan had been given all the German possessions in the Western Pacific north of the equator, the Marianas and the Carolines, which became known as the Japanese Mandates. The Japanese were bound by a 553 agreement whereby for every 5 capital ships that either Great Britain or the United States built, Japan could build only 3. Japan had pushed vigorously for a higher ratio, but the objection of her representatives were to no avail. In the post-war years, Japan built to the limit of the 553 agreement. In 1923, Lieutenant Sun Shirkira, later a Vice Admiral, made aviation history as the first pilot to land on Japan's first carrier, the Hosho. By 1927, the fleet included 4 carriers. In 1928-29, Yamamoto commanded the aircraft carrier Akagi, and his pro-naval aviation voice was now being heard at the highest levels of the government. He was selected to attend the Naval Disarmament Conference in London in 1930, and was a leader in obtaining agreement to give Japan equality with the British and Americans in the number of submarines and light cruisers that each could build. After the conference, Yamamoto was promoted to Rear Admiral and appointed head of the Technical Research Division of the Navy, where his views about the future of aircraft as an extension of naval power carried great weight. In 1933, he became commander of Carrier Division 1. Potter tells of his growing convictions about carrier aviation. Yamamoto wanted torpedo planes and long-range bombers, but most of all he wanted a fast fighter that could fly off the deck of an aircraft carrier. He gave orders to the Japanese aircraft factories to produce their own planes. Experimentally, Mitsubishi, the big industrial combine, submitted plans for a Navy fighter which became the famous Zero. At the same time, with the militarists gaining increasing control of the Japanese government, the naval hold down was more and more actively criticized in Japan. The outcry became so great that it was decided in 1934 to hold another naval conference in London. The obvious Japanese representative was Vice Admiral Yamamoto, who had already publicly attacked the Japanese naval ratio as this national degradation. He was named chief delegate with full decision powers. He sailed from Yokohama for Seattle, spending most of his time in his cabin playing poker. When he arrived in the United States, he refused all newspaper interviews. He also refused to read the American papers in case any cunning Western arguments might sway him. Before he could put Japan's case at the conference, American newspapers took a great interest in him. He was given wide coverage as he traveled across America to New York in a locked train compartment. At the time, General William Billy Mitchell, outspoken aviation proponent, was lobbying for greater American military air strength. His view was that American military planes must be designed specifically to fight Japan. In the Pacific newspapers daily gave prominence to his dramatic statements that war with Japan was inevitable. When Yamamoto reached New York, he still refused to see reporters. His aides brushed them off, saying, "So sorry, but the Admiral does not speak English." This rebuff was never questioned, and a record of his years in the United States was apparently not on file in American newspaper offices. Yamamoto sailed for England, refusing to leave his cabin when he landed at Southampton on the morning of October 18, 1934. He called a press conference and in English announced that Japan can no longer submit to the ratio system. There is no possibility of compromise by my government on that point. Thus the 1934 London naval parley was doomed. Before it began, it was the last attempt to limit naval forces by treaty. The failure of the London Conference marked the beginning of Japanese naval independence and the rise of Yamamoto as a powerful influence in Japanese military affairs. He was appointed Vice Minister of the Navy in 1936 and began to vehemently oppose the battleship admirals who saw no future in the aircraft carrier. By now, Yamamoto was firmly convinced that no navy could be successful in a future war if its fleets were not formed around ships carrying planes. Aircraft could act as scouts and bombers, and thus take the fight to the enemy before the surface ships were close enough to do battle. Despite strong resistance, Yamamoto won out when the keels of several new carriers were laid. He commented that battleships are like elaborate religious scrolls which old people hang up in their homes. They are of no proved worth. They are primarily a matter of faith, not reality. Although the Target of continual criticism, Yamamoto prevailed and expanded his own views on naval aviation to include the manufacture of long-range flying boats that could fly 800 m with 2,000 pounds of bombs. He encouraged increased production and improvement of the Mitsubishi Zero, which could operate from the new carriers being built. The Japanese were successful in protecting their growing naval strength from public view as the 1930s were winding down. English language magazines and newspapers reported that war with Japan was impossible because the country's army and navy had few planes that could stand up against the British and American fighters then being built on both sides of the Atlantic. Behind the closed doors of the Imperial Japanese Defense Establishment at the end of World War I, secret documents had clearly indicated that the United States was the leading potential enemy of Japan, with Russia second. Consequently, the Navy's war planners envisioned attacking American possessions in the Pacific. Army strategists saw the future as a land war against Russia. Yamamoto was highly skeptical about the formalistic views of the Navy General Staff and Navy Staff College, which made assumptions he could not accept. 1. Japan would attack the Philippines. 2. The U.S. fleet would sail to the aid of the Philippines. 3. Japan would wage a war of attrition in the Marianas. And 4. There would be a great sea battle between the two fleets in which the American fleet would be destroyed. In the late 1930s, American military strategists began to sense the growing threat to American interests in the Pacific, and the U.S. Navy was ordered to strengthen its power base in Hawaii instead of the West Coast. This convinced many Japanese Army and Navy leaders that the United States was clearly preparing for war against Japan. The Japanese began to think in terms of attacking Pearl Harbor by sea, as had been discussed in military circles for many years. However, the planners did not consider the use of carrier-based aircraft. Initially concurrently hit, and Mussolini urged Japan to join them in a tripartite pact. Japanese army leaders saw this possibility as a strong asset and pressed for approval. However, a number of top naval leaders, including Yamamoto, opposed the idea, and Yamamoto became exceptionally outspoken in his belief that it would be foolish to join with the two dictatorships and thus declare openly that America was a chosen enemy. He wrote in a statement of his views that a war between Japan and the United States would be a major calamity for the world, and for Japan it would mean, after several years of war already with China, acquiring yet another powerful enemy. An extremely perilous matter for the nation. It is necessary that both Japan and America should seek every means to avoid a direct clash, and Japan should under no circumstances conclude an alliance with Germany. Despite the opposition, the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy was signed on September 27, 1940. His outspokenness made him many enemies, according to Potter. Particularly among the extreme nationalists, they called him pro-American and a traitor to his country, and threatened to terminate him. The only way to remove him from the daily peril to which his outspoken anti-war stand had brought him was to remove him from the political sphere altogether. In mid-August 1939 he was appointed commander of the First Fleet, and in 1940 was given command of the combined fleet with the rank of full admiral. The transfer from the dangerous political position as Navy Vice Minister to sea duty meant strict obedience to the imperial rescript. Men of the services should not participate in politics. Characteristically, Yamamoto threw himself forcefully into his new responsibilities and announced the policy he would follow in the months ahead. First priority was the training of aircraft carrier pilots. Yamamoto's concern about aircrew training was based on the results of a bombing exercise he had ordered, in which 36 planes bombing level from 1,000 feet scored only a single hit on an old battleship being used as a stationary target. However, 3 dive bombers scored 1 hit with a bomb and 1 with a torpedo. Consequently, many of his staff officers thought level bombing should be abandoned in favor of dive bombing. Yamamoto disagreed and ordered more training in both level and dive bombing for all pilots. Potter noted this was 2.5 years before Pearl Harbor. It was the first glimpse of an idea for attacking stationary targets such as anchored warships. By the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese planes had undoubtedly attained the world's highest rate of accuracy in level bombing attacks. It is not possible to determine exactly when Yamamoto first thought about a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, but it may well have entered his mind from reading a 1925 novel entitled The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Naval correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph, Bywater predicted that a war would begin between the United States and Japan with a sneak attack by the Japanese against naval forces of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet cruising off Manila Bay. This book and a previous non-fiction book by Bywater entitled Sea Power in the Pacific were translated into Japanese and distributed among students at the Naval Academy and to the officer corps throughout the Navy. Being an avid student of naval affairs throughout his career, it can be assumed that Yamamoto read both books when the intensive air training program that Yamamoto had instigated paid off in better bombing results. He began to think seriously, albeit reluctantly, that if war came, a long-range preemptive air strike against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor would be necessary to remove the threat to Japan's plans for conquest. In the spring of 1940, he casually mentioned the possibility to his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome aboard the Nagato. Yamamoto said an air attack on Hawaii may be possible now, especially as our air training has turned out so successfully. By April 1941, the plan for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, now called Operation Z, was being finalized. Concurrently, Japanese Army leaders were gathering intelligence information for operations against Hong Kong, Singapore, Java, Sumatra, and the Philippines. They concentrated on extensive sea maneuvers, which included a simulation of a Pearl Harbor attack. Despite the preparations, Yamamoto had some doubts. He told Premier Fumimaro Kuno, "If you tell me it is necessary that we fight, then in the first 6 months to a year of war against the United States and England, I will go wild, and I will show you an uninterrupted succession of victories. But I must tell you that if the war be prolonged for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory." One of the reasons for Yamamoto's concern harkened back to his studies of the oil industry at Harvard. In the summer of 1941, the United States, England, and Holland placed an embargo on oil, steel, and scrap iron sales to Japan. As a result, the Japanese Navy had only enough oil on hand for an estimated 18 months of operations. This fact speeded up plans to capture the rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, assuming that there would be Japanese superiority in the Western Pacific. The Army intended to sweep through the coastal regions of China to the oil-rich areas to the south. Although Yamamoto proceeded with his own plan to attack Hawaii, he remained reluctant and put his finger on a fatal weakness of the Japanese concept of war when he stated, "It is not enough that we should take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House." Yam was thoroughly convinced that the only way he could be successful at Pearl Harbor was to mount a surprise attack by a massive fleet of carrier-based aircraft with the assistance of Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Rear Admiral Takeru Onishi, and Commodore Minoru Gender. Yamamoto planned a force composed of Japan's 6 largest carriers, 2 fast battleships, 2 cruisers, and a number of destroyers, tankers, and supporting ships. By May 1941, Yamamoto had accepted the decision to go to war, but only on the condition that his plan to attack Pearl Harbor without warning be incorporated into the master plan. He threatened to resign if this was not done. He won the argument. On November 5, 1941, Yamamoto issued Combined Fleet Secret Operational Order No. 1, a 151-page document that outlined the tactics to be followed for the Pearl Harbor attack and simultaneous assaults on Malaysia, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and Hong Kong. Emperor Hito agreed to war against the United States on December 1. Hostilities were to begin on the morning of X Day, December 8, in Japan. December 7 in Hawaii. A Sunday when the war began, the United States had 17 battleships, 6 aircraft carriers, and 32 cruisers distributed about equally between the Atlantic and Pacific. The Japanese had 10 battleships, 9 aircraft carriers, and 46 cruisers, all stationed in the Western Pacific. This superiority was due to Yamamoto's strong influence in the naval planning process and his input into the formation of national military policy. On the morning of December 7, 1941, his once controversial views about whether the employment of carrier-based aircraft in a surprise attack would be successful were completely vindicated. At 3:25 a.m. Tokyo time, the first 500B bomb was dropped on Wheeler Field and the one-sided battle began on board the Nagato anchored at Hashira-jima. Yamamoto received the news calmly. In 1 hour and 15 minutes the American Navy lost 18 ships, including 7 battleships sunk or seriously damaged. Fortunately, the 2 Pacific Fleet carriers Enterprise and Lexington were at sea ferrying aircraft to Waken Midway Islands. The Saratoga was being overhauled on the west coast. U.S. naval installation were severely crippled. Of the 169 Navy planes in Hawaii, 92 were destroyed, 39 damaged, 3 Army Air Corps installations were badly damaged. Of the 231 planes assigned to the Hawaiian Air Force, 96 were destroyed. There were 43 American military personnel and civilians terminated and hundreds more wounded. At 6 a.m. in Tokyo, a joint communique by the Army and Navy was issued on the radio before dawn today, December 8. The Imperial Army and Navy entered upon a state of hostilities with British and American forces in the West Pacific. A few hours later there was a further announcement. Before dawn on December 8, the Imperial Navy carried out a crippling blow on U.S. naval and air forces in the Hawaii area. The Japanese lost only 29 of the 353 planes taking part: 1 large and 5 submarines, 55 airmen and 9 submarines. Maras, the Japanese force led by Admiral Chichi Nagumo, returned to Japanese waters as heroes. Yamamoto radioed congratulations from the Nagato. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leader of the attacking planes, was invited to the Imperial Palace for an audience with Emperor Hirohito, a rare honor for a junior officer. Yamamoto received a personal letter of congratulations from the Emperor and a handsome set of sake cups. Before Pearl Harbor, only a handful of American naval officers had ever heard of Isoroku Yamamoto, a British historian commented, but after the 7th of December 1941 his name was on everyone's lips. To every American he became the embodiment of Japanese evil, the treacherous aggressor, the man who not only planned the Pearl Harbor attack but who in his arrogance was also believed to be planning to dictate terms in the White House. Admiral Homer N. Wallen, in a book published in 1968, wrote that Yamamoto was well schooled and well regarded by American officers, was a sophisticated poker player given to successful bluffing. He was regarded as bold and venturesome, but to some he was headstrong and lacking in prudence. The plans for the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had been Yamamoto's, and his alone. He had supervised every detail, fought for the concept over the opposition of every senior admiral, and saw that the attack was carried out. He had wanted peace but accepted war. In the days following Pearl Harbor, despite the praise he received, Yamamoto was still pessimistic about the future. He wrote to his sister Kazuko, "Well, war has begun at last, but in spite of all the clamor that is going on, we could lose it. I can only do my best to win." Unidentified friend, he wrote, "This war will give us much trouble in the future. The fact that we have had a small success at Pearl Harbor is nothing. The fact that we have succeeded so easily has pleased people. Personally, I do not think it is a good thing to whip up propaganda to encourage the nation. People should think things over and realize how serious the situation is." Despite his doubts, the first 3 months of 1942 were full of Japanese military successes. The Dutch East Indies were under Japanese control. The large British base at Singapore was in their hands. Americans in the Philippines were fighting in desperate retreat. Yamamoto was a national hero, and all future naval planning was now his responsibility. Admiral Osamu Nagano, head of the Naval General Staff, theoretically had the power to issue orders to Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, but Yamamoto, because of his Pearl Harbor success, actually planned future naval operations. The General Staff's function became one of refereeing when disagreements arose. Arguments did ensue over what to do next. Yamamoto had always favored capturing Midway Island to use as a base for more operations against Hawaii and occupying vital points in the Union Islands. However, he met strong resistance from the Army and the desk-bound admirals in Tokyo. That resistance crumbled on April 18, 1942, when 16 American B-25 medium bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Diddle appeared over Tokyo and 4 other Japanese cities and dropped incendiary and high-explosive bombs on military and industrial targets. The American 16-ship task force centered around the carrier Hornet and Enterprise had been detected about 650 miles off the Japanese coast by the Nitomaru, a fishing boat on picket duty. Yamamoto issued orders to the 21st Air Flotilla to dispatch medium bombers and fighters from their bases near Tokyo, but they never saw the invaders. Everyone, including Yamamoto, believed the American planes were carrier planes with limited range, but these were land-based B-25 Army Air Force bombers and thus were believed incapable of being launched from a carrier. Yamamoto and his staff were unable at first to determine the takeoff point of the bombers and thought it might be Midway or some base in the oceans. Yet Midway was 2,250 miles away, and the nearest American base in the U.S. was much farther. Jimmy Diddle and his raiders had convinced Yamamoto what he should do next: carry out the Midway Aleutian Plan. On May 5, 1942, he issued the orders in a letter to Admiral Minichi Koga dated May 2, 1942. Yamamoto confided how embarrassed he was about the Deutsch raid. He wrote, "Even though there wasn't much damage, it's a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down." It provides a regrettably graphic illustration of the saying that a bungling attack is better than the most skilled defense. On May 8, the naval battle occurred in the Coral Sea, where an American task force, including the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, engaged the enemy and for the first time sank a Japanese ship larger than a destroyer, although the Lexington was lost along with a destroyer and an oiler. The Americans seemed to come off best. The Japanese lost the carrier Shikaku, a destroyer, and 3 smaller vessels later that month, as the Midway attack force, consisting of 5 carriers and 11 battleships and the UN force with 2 carriers, steamed toward their target destinations. Yamamoto assumed that the American carriers Hornet and Enterprise were in the South Pacific. They weren't. On June 3, the UN force struck the UNs with a bombing attack on Dutch Harbor and unopposed landings on Atu and Kisa. On June 6-7, the Midway force launched 108 planes against the tiny island. On June 4, unknown to the Japanese, a relatively small force of Army Air Force bombers operating from Hawaii, along with Navy and Marine fighters aboard the carriers Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise, had been assembled for the expected onslaught by the 350 vessels steaming toward Midway, the largest naval force ever assembled. On June 6, the enemy was engaged, and when the battle was over 48 hours later, the Japanese had lost 4 of their 6 carriers, a cruiser, 14 other ships, and most of their air groups, please, and pilots, the best in the Japanese Navy. The Americans lost only 2 large ships, the carrier Yorktown and a destroyer. The greatest sea battle since Trafalgar was over. More Japanese died that day than on both sides of any naval battle of World War I. It was the first and last gigantic carrier battle in the history of the world. Masataka Okumura, one of the pilots on the Midway operation, commented, "The loss of 4 aircraft carriers shocked the Japanese people. We could not understand the gravity of the defeat, for these 4 carriers had played the major role in the Navy's smashing victories across the breadth of the Pacific. An even greater blow, however, was the loss of the irreplaceable veteran air crews and the skilled maintenance crews which went down with their ships. How could a fleet as large as Yamamoto had organized be turned back at Midway by such a relatively small American force, in addition to the interception of Japanese messages and the capability to assemble a force of Army, Air Force, and Navy fighters and bombers? Another reason for the Japanese defeat was overconfidence. The Midway Aleutian operation was too ambitious. Too many objectives over a wide area of the Pacific had been undertaken in too short a time frame, and too many false assumptions about the Americans had been made in the planning process. However, the landings on Kisa and Atu meant that the Japanese occupied American soil for the first time in history. It was small compensation for the losses from the Midway operation, but there was one major advantage the Americans had that the Japanese thought was an impossibility. The top-secret Japanese naval code had been broken by American cryptographers, and all radio messages relating to the oncoming attack had been intercepted. This fact, and Yamamoto's passion for keeping precise schedules, eventually sealed the personal fate of the reluctant admiral. April 18th was Easter Sunday, but there were no religious holidays on Guadalcanal in 1943. Mitchell hadn't slept well the night before, even though there had been no visit from Washing Machine Charlie, the Japanese bomber that paid occasional night bombing calls on Guadalcanal with His unsynchronized propellers, for which he had become notorious, the details of the forthcoming mission kept going through his mind, although anxious to fly the mission because of the promise of action against a gaggle of enemy planes. He still wondered about the chances of intercepting Yamamoto bomber. There was a 2-hour difference between the Americans' time and that of the Japanese. Enemy forces kept all their operations on Tokyo time, while the Americans used local time. If somebody made a mistake in timing, it wasn't his fault. He shrugged down a quick breakfast at the mess tent and rounded up his pilots for the permission briefing. I cautioned them about strict radio silence on the trip out, Mitchell recalled, and told them I would use the usual signals of kicking my rudders to fishtail my plane when I wanted the formation to spread out, and wagging my wings to bring them in close. I would use hand signals, otherwise I urged them to check the belly tank installations on their ships during their pre-flight walkarounds and switch to them soon after takeoff to be sure they would feed. He also said he wanted them to fly a loose formation and warned again about the dangers of flying only a few feet above the ocean for the 2 hours or so it would take them to make landfall at Bonneville. There's a 10 why to daydream and get sleepy on a trip like this, he cautioned. You're going to be hot, and it's going to be boring. Don't stare at the water. Your depth perception goes to hell down low like that, and you're going to bust your butt if you get careless. Spread out when I give this signal and fly off my lead. I won't surprise you with any sharp turns. Mitchell strode briskly down the line of lightnings, looking in the revetments, exchanging a few words with the mechanics and crews along the flight line. He greeted his ground crew and asked his crew chief about the belly tank installation on his airplane and the other planes. The guys were up all night, the sergeant replied. Everybody check their tanks to be sure they will feed, and that compass the Navy sent over from Henderson was put in, so you're all set. Mitchell nodded, climbed up on the wing of his Lightning, buckled his parachute leg straps, and eased into the cockpit. He checked the installation of the large Navy compass and started the twin Allison engines acting on his engine start. The other 177 pilots cranked up and followed him out to the run-up position after checking both engines carefully. Mitchell lined up on the runway. He paused to check the compass to see if it read the same as the runway heading. It was right on the money, he said, so I knew it was going to be all right. Certainly an improvement over my regular compass. It made me feel better about flying the courses out. If the wind stayed light as predicted, our chances of getting to Bonneville sight unseen and time seemed better now. It was up to the Admiral to do his part. At 710, Mitchell held the brakes as he reveed both engines up to full RPMs. He released the brakes, checked the compass alignment with runway heading 1 more, and was quickly airborne. He was followed by Lieutenant Julius Jacobson, his wingman, then Lieutenants Doug Canning and Delton Girk. He started a slow left climbing turn to 2,000 foot. Next in line was the 4-plane flight captain Tom Lanier and Lieutenants Rex T. Barber, James D. McClanahan, and Joseph F. Moore. Barber was flying Miss Virginia because his own Diablo was grounded for maintenance. Lanier admitted having pre-combat stomach as he taxied out in Phoebe, the nickname for his fiancée and future wife. Phyllis Lanphier and Bearer got off easily, but McClanahan had to abort just as he was about to reach flying speed. One of his tires struck an upturned piece of the pierced metal planking on the runway and was in ly. Flattened. His plane lurched and veered off the runway to a stop. He told the author, it was one of the saddest days of my life. I really wanted to go on that one. I still get mad every time I think about it. Mitchell continued circling slowly to allow Major Lewis Kell leading the remaining planes of the top cover flight to catch up. Kell, an avid hunter like in the upcoming mission to a trophy hunt, and hoped he wouldn't have to abort. He knew how important Yamamoto was, making this a far different mission than others. We were briefed very thoroughly about strict radio silence. He said that seems like a simple instruction, but normally there was a lot of chatter when flights are trying to get organized. We all realized this was a special mission when the last man was airborne and had joined up. Mitchell began a slow descent toward the water on a heading of 265 degrees. It was now 7:25 as each pilot settled into position and spread out when Mitchell signaled. They switched fuel selectors from internal fuel to the belly tanks. After a few seconds, Joe Moore's engines coughed, and he quickly switched back to the mains. He tried again, but the belly tanks would not feed. Disappointed, he pulled up beside Lania and hand signaled that he would have to return to Fighter 2. Lieutenant Beesby F. Holmes and his Wingman Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine, the spare pilots were signaled to fill out the attack flights for plane. Compliment Mitchell hoped no one else would have to drop out on the night of April 17 at Rabel Rear Admiral Tsuji. Joshua, concerned that the message announcing Yamamoto's itinerary may have been intercepted, pleaded with his superior to cancel the trip. "I have to go," Yamamoto said. "I have let them know and they will have got things ready for me. I will leave tomorrow morning and be back by dusk." On his previous inspection trips, Yamamoto had always worn an immaculate white uniform. However, on the morning of April 18 he put on a new dark green simplified uniform. The Lightnings plodded westward, and as they passed south of the Russell Islands, now in American hands, two Betty bombers, tail numbers 323 and 326, departed Vaca Air Base at Rabaul for the 7-mile flight to Lanai Field to await the Admiral and his staff at 5:45 Japanese time, precisely as scheduled. The two Betty bomb with the VIPs aboard roared off the coral strip and climbed to about 6,500 feet. 60 fighters followed and formed into 2 3-ship Vs behind, and about 1,500 foot higher on each side of the Bettys they would follow a direct course southeast for Bun 315 m away. The weather was perfect for flying. They would be on time for a landing at Ball Island at 9:45. The 16 Lightnings droned on above of the unblemished blue ocean. There was nothing to disturb the scene, no ships, no land, no other planes, nothing. Mitchell remembers it was hot as hell in those cockpits, and I dozed off a couple of times, but I got a light tap on my shoulder from the man upstairs and caught myself. One of the Lightning pilots got too low, and his propeller tips splashed seawater over his windshield. "I know damn well that woke him up," Mitchell said. "He had to clean off his windshield when he got back. I think that's the only thing he had to clean up, but word got back to me later that he wasn't able to get back to sleep for a couple of days." De Gerkier said he was hot, nervous, anxious. I suppose the word for it was scared. I certainly had faith in Mitch and our ability to be where and when he wanted to be, but there were so many ifs on the part of the Japanese. The odds were against us, but even the slightest possibility of success made the mission worthwhile. Doug Canning recalled that the ocean was uncommonly calm and there were few white caps because there was practically no wind. He spotted several schools of sharks and a huge manta ray, which reminded him that danger lurked only a few feet below if any of them went down. Mitchell kept watching the compass and checked his watch frequently. After flying on a heading of 265 degrees on the first and longest leg for 55 minutes, he turned 25 degrees right to 290 degrees. 27 minutes later he turned to 305 degrees. This leg was flown for 38 minutes, then to 20 degrees for the 40-mile leg to the south edge of Empress Bay toward the coast. As he crossed the bay he turned to 90 degrees and wagged his wings to signal the planes to tighten up their respective formations. We were about 4 minutes out, and I was getting nervous then. Mitchell admits it was hazy when we made that last turn toward land and the sun was directly in front of us. I couldn't see anything, no land, nothing. I checked my watch, the strip map on my knee pad, and the compass. Could I have been so far off that we weren't near land at all, any kind of land? I was really getting itchy because I hadn't seen a single checkpoint from the time we left. There are some pretty high hills on Bonneville, and I couldn't see anything ahead in the haze and sunlight. I glanced once more at my strip map, and then ahead out of the haze I saw a beach, and there we were, just about where I wanted us to be, off the southwest corner of Bonneville. It was 9:34. A minute ahead of our scheduled time, just as I thought I'd better do something now. Doug Kane Ning, flying number 3 in my flight, broke radio silence and said bogies 11 o'clock high. I looked up, and there they were 5 mil away at about 4,500 feet, descending 2 Betty bombers instead of 1 and 6 zeros behind them, about a th feet higher. I rogered and said I have them. We were still on the deck then, and heading toward them at a 90 degrees angle. I turned right parallel with their track and firewalled it to climb as fast as we could. I told the guys to skin off your tanks, pulled my own belly tank release, and watched as Jacobson, Canning, and Gerkier dropped theirs as we reached the level of the Bettys, and still parallel with them. Holmes, in the elimination flight, radioed that he couldn't get his tanks off and pulled away from the formation back out over the water. That was a mistake as far as I was concerned. Hine, his wingmen, rightfully followed him to protect him. I called to Lanfear, he's your meat, Tom acknowledged, and the 2 remaining planes of the elimination flight turned toward the 8 enemy planes and continued climbing. The rest of us also continued climbing for a couple of miles. Parallel to the Japanese planes, I have to admit it was very tempting to me to want to level off and pull over to get at them. If I had known they weren't going to send any fighters up from Kahili to greet the Admiral, I would have made the attack. I would have taken over Lanier or anyone else, be damned. I would have gone in first. I selected the high cover because I thought we'd have a field day with at least half of those 75 fighters coming at us from Kahil. They didn't send any at all, a big disappointment to me and the rest of the Coven night. I kept climbing to about 18,000 feet as I had briefed everyone in the cover flight we would do. There was a lot of chatter on the radio. I looked down and saw some black smoke coming out of the jungle. Lanier said something about a plane going down, and did I see it? I told him I saw a pillar of smoke coming out of the jungle, but I had no way of knowing if it was a Betty A-0 or AP-38. I saw none of the action below. There was considerable chatter on the radio after I called Lania to take his flight into the attack. I remember Lanier complaining about zeros on his tail. I tried to find out where he was, but was able to do so. About that time I saw Lieutenant Hines' aircraft smoking in one engine several thousand feet below me. I was then busy for a few minutes knocking this zero off his tail, but never saw Hine again. I have no idea what happened to him. When I couldn't find him, I called the squadron and said, "Leighton, go home." The stories of the members of the elimination flight differ from the moment Mitchell told his pilots to skin off your tanks and ordered Lanfear to do what they had come to do first. Lanier's version, which was published in the New York Times, September 12, 1945, I angled across in front of Yamamoto's formation, straining to reach at least the same altitude as his formation before being spotted. Major Mitchell was in a rocketing climb, scanning the air for Japanese fighters from Kahili. Neither Mitch's section nor mine was discovered by the Japanese in the tense 2 minutes after we sighted the enemy. During those 2 minutes, though, I lost Holmes, and Hein Holmes called out that he couldn't drop his belly tanks. He leveled off and went on down the coast, kicking and swinging his ship in frantic attempts to tear them off. Hein, as his wingman, was compelled to stay with him. Bearer and I got to a point 2 miles to Yamamoto's right and about a mile in front of him before his zero cover saw us. They must have screamed the warning into their radios, because we saw their belly tanks drop a sign that they were clearing for action, and they nosed over in a group to dive on us, on Rex and me. We closed in fast. 3 Zeros, which had been flying the seaward side of the Yamamoto formation, came tearing down between it and us, trying to intercept us before we could reach Yamamoto's bomber. Right behind them were the 3 Japanese Zeros from the inshore side of the formation. Holmes and Hein were off down the beach, out of sight, and Mitch and his group were out of sight too, climbing with throttles wide toward what they had every reason to believe would be the biggest fight of all. Top Japanese cover from Kahili. I was afraid we had never get to the bomber that Admiral Yamamoto rode before the Zeros got us. I horsed back on my wheel to get my guns to bear on the lead Zero diving toward me. Buck fever started me firing before I had my lightning's nose pointed in his direction. I saw the gray smoke from his wing guns and wondered with stupid detachment if the bullets would get me before I could work my guns onto him. He was a worse shot than I was, and he died. My machine guns and cannon ripped one of his wings away. He twisted under me. His 2 wingmen hurtled past, and I wasted a few bursts between them. Then I thought I would better get my job done and go away. Before I got hurt, I kicked my ship over on its back and looked down for the lead Japanese bomber. It had dived inland. As I hung in the sky, I got an impression off to the east of a swirl of aircraft against the blue, a single lightning silhouetted against the light in a swarm of Zeros. That was Barber having himself a time. Excitement in a fight works wonders with a man's vision. In the same brief second that I saw Rex on my right and saw the Zeros I had just overshot, I spotted a shadow moving across the treetops. It was Yamamoto's bomber. It was skimming the jungle, headed for Kahil. I dived toward him. I realized on the way down that I had picked up too much speed, that I might overshoot him. I cut back my throttles. I crossed my controls and went into a skid to break my dive. The 2 Zeros that had overshot me showed up again, diving toward Yamamoto's bomber from an angle slightly off to my right. They meant to get me before I got the bomber. It looked from where I sat as if the bomber, the Zeros, and I might all get To the same place at the same time we very nearly did the next 3 or 4 seconds spelled life or death. I remember getting suddenly very stubborn about making the most of the one good shot I had coming up. I fired a long steady burst across the bomber's course of flight from approximately right angles. The bomber's right engine and its right wing burst into flame. I had accomplished my part of the mission once a fire no Japanese plane stopped burning short of blowing up. The men aboard the bomber were too close to the ground to jump. The 2 onrushing Zeros saw it too. They screamed past overhead, unwilling to chance a jungle crash to get me in that second. I realized my impetus would carry me directly behind the Mitsubishi's tail cannon. My Lightning's belly was scraping the trees. I couldn't duck under the Mitsubishi, and I hesitated to pull up over its line of fire because I already was going so slow I almost hung in midair, near stalling speed. I expected those Zeros back too just as I moved into range of Yamamoto's bomber and its cannon. The bomber's wing tore off. The bomber plunged into the jungle. It exploded. That was the end of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Right about then, though, I got scared. I had slowed so much to get my shots at Yamamoto's bomber that I was caught, so to speak, with my pants and my heart around my ankles. My airspeed indicator coldly told me I was doing only about 220 miles per hour or less than cruising speed, and I had only 10 feet of altitude. For the first time on the mission, I pushed my mic button and called Mitchell. I asked him to send down anybody who wasn't busy. The 2 Japanese Zeros were diving at me again, almost at right angles to my left. I hugged the earth and the treetops while they made passes at me. I unwittingly LED'd them smack across a corner of the Japanese fighter strip at Kahili, where Zeros were scrambling in the dust to take off. I made the harbor and headed east with the Japanese on my tail. I got into a speedy climb. At 20,000 I lost them. I was away with only 2 bullet holes in my rudder, nothing more except a year or 2 off my life. Mitchell and his flight, responding to my call, came piled dry down out of the sky and dispersed the Zeros. Contrary to all expectation, Mitch's covering section had met no resistance. Not one Zero had poked its nose higher than 5,000 feet that day. Going home, Mitchell called out to all pilots the mission had been accomplished. Everyone in top cover had seen the 2 bombers crash in the jungle in flames. There was no doubt of their complete destruction. In addition to the New York Times article, a bylined article by Lanier was distributed by the North American Newspaper Alliance in 1945. While there were some similarities in the 2 stories, the Nano story had a more colorful description of Lanier's alleged shoot-down after stating he had shot down one Z and then kicked his P-38 over on its back. He said, "I spotted a shadow moving across the treetops below. I focused on it, and found it to be the elusive bomber I was seeking. It was skimming along the surface of the jungle. Headed once more for Kahili, he was moving directly across from my left as I too flattened out on the treetops, and prepared to slide up beside him for a point-blank shot. As I moved in on him, I began to realize that I had picked up too much speed in my dive and was going to overshoot him unless I slowed down. For the first time since we had sighted the Japanese formation, I cut back on my throttles. Crossing my controls, I went into a skid to further break my speed. As I did so, the 2 Zeros I had not spoken to as we passed up upstairs showed up again. They too were diving toward the bomber from an angle slightly off to my right. Their intent was obviously to try and get me before I got the bomber from where I sat. It looked very much like the bomber. The 2 Zeros and I were going to arrive at the same place at the same time. We very nearly did. The next 3 or 4 seconds became a life and death problem in time and distance. I remember feeling very stubborn just then about making the most of that one good shot I had coming up at that bomber, no matter to what the high PRIC talent in the 2 Zeros wanted to make of it. I applied myself to my gunnery, and taking no chances of missing, began firing a long steady burst across the bomber's line of flight from approximately right angles. Long before I considered myself in range, the bomber's right engine and then his right wing began to burn. I had accomplished my part of the mission. The 2 onrushing Zeros shot by just then, apparently unwilling to chance a crash in the jungle in order to get me. At the same instant they swooped across the top of my canopy. I was having trouble from another source. Out of the bomber's tail was puffing a steady series of shots from the cannon lodged back there, my belly already scraping the trees. I could not duck under it, and I hesitated to pull up over its line of fire since I was already going so slow that I would be left hanging in midair in a sitting duck position near stalling speed, and the bothersome pair of Zeros were undoubtedly scurrying around into position for another pass at me just as I moved into range of its cannon. The bomber's right wing came off and it plunged into the jungle and exploded. A glance to my left told me that my 2 Zeros had not forgotten me. They were diving on me once again, this time from almost right angles to my left. For the first time that day I pushed my microphone button and called Mitchell. I asked him to send down anybody who was not busy at the moment to help me out. I called him once again to ask him to verify the burning bomber. He replied that he could see it. I then lied myself completely to keeping myself alive. Lanfear described how the pursuing Zeros continued to press their attack but failed to hit him. He said he hugged the ground and zipped in and out of the gullies to escape the 2 Zeros and led them unwittingly across the Kahil airfield. He stated he saw 3 columns of black smoke rising out of the jungle behind him, which were the burning bomber containing Yamamoto and 2 of his accompanying aircraft. He climbed to 20,000 feet and left the AA. Except for the anti-aircraft from the harbor below, I was bothered no further. He continues. His narrative bearer was not quite so fortunate. When I had pulled up into the Zeros on our first contact with the enemy, Rex had bored on, and after the bomber coming our way, ignoring the other 3 Zeros who were by no means ignoring him, he opened fire on his target. The bomber passed under his right wing, still apparently undamaged despite the fact that he was now the concerted target of all 3 escorting Zeros. He buelled his way back through their fire and latched onto the bomber once again. This time he drove his attack perfectly home, blasting off the entire tail section of the Mitsubishi, which rolled over on its back and plummeted to the earth far below. No one jumped out of it.